Have you ever felt like your sacrifices for your children go unnoticed or taken for granted? You devote your time, your energy, and your love to help them achieve their dreams, yet the appreciation you expect seems to disappear into thin air. Instead of gratitude, you're met with exhaustion, frustration, and sometimes even resentment. If you find yourself nodding along, you're not alone. This is a struggle faced by many parents, especially as they grow older. In today's video, we're going to dive deep into the stories of several elderly parents who gave everything to support their children, only to find themselves worn out, neglected, and, in some cases, completely disregarded. We'll explore their experiences, the emotional and physical toll of constant giving, and the sometimes painful reality of feeling invisible in the very family you've poured your life into. By the end of this video, you'll gain valuable insights into why setting boundaries is crucial, not just for your emotional health but for your physical well-being as well. You'll learn how unconditional love, though commendable, can sometimes unintentionally create unhealthy family dynamics. We'll talk about how parents can take steps to protect their happiness and health while still being there for their children, and why it's important to take a step back, give your children space to grow, and allow them to become more independent. Whether you're a parent, grandparent, or simply someone who values meaningful relationships, this video will provide you with essential advice on how to nurture healthier, more balanced family connections. By the end, you'll have practical strategies for setting boundaries, preserving your well-being, and ensuring you can continue supporting your loved ones in a way that's healthy for everyone. Before we dive in, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support truly means a lot to me, and if you find value in this video, please like, share, and comment so that others can benefit from these important lessons, too. If you resonate with the topic of today's video, I encourage you to comment 1 below. And if you feel there's room for improvement, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to comment 0 to let me know how I can make future videos even better for you. Alright, now let's get started. To dive deeper into this complex issue, today's video is going to share a heart-wrenching real-life story that many of you may find painfully familiar. One that is all too common yet far too often overlooked in families across America. It's the story of Thomas Anderson, a 72-year-old retired teacher, and his wife, Helen, who also spent decades shaping young minds in their classrooms. After years of tireless work, they had earned their well-deserved retirement. They decided to leave the chaos and stress of the city behind, seeking peace in their quiet hometown in the heart of the Midwest. They dreamed of tending to their beloved garden, nurturing vibrant flowers, and raising a flock of chickens. It was a dream come true, a life full of simple joys, where the days felt endless and contentment settled in their bones. But, as often happens, life had other plans. Everything they had carefully built was suddenly thrown into disarray when their only son, Michael, and his wife, Sarah, announced they were expecting their first child. Michael, who had long since moved to Chicago with Sarah, called his parents, asking them for help. They couldn't afford a reliable babysitter in the city, and they desperately needed Thomas and Helen to move in and assist with the newborn. At first, Thomas gently suggested that they hire a professional caregiver, but Michael quickly shot down the idea, claiming it was far too expensive in their urban setting and that trustworthy caregivers were hard to come by. After a heartfelt discussion, Thomas and Helen agreed to put their peaceful retirement on pause, under the promise that they would return to their serene life once their grandchild reached kindergarten. They moved into the city, thinking they were simply lending a helping hand to their son and his growing family. But what started as a temporary, loving gesture soon spiraled into a full-time job. Thomas and Helen didn't just help with their new grandchild, they found themselves shouldering every responsibility that came with running a household. From shopping for groceries to cooking meals, cleaning the house, and managing the daily chaos that comes with raising a child, they did it all. Michael and Sarah were consumed with their demanding careers, leaving little time or energy for the household. So, Thomas and Helen stepped in, selflessly giving up their golden years of relaxation to keep the family running smoothly. At first, everything felt fulfilling. They were helping, they were contributing, and the love they felt for their grandchild made the work feel worthwhile. But over time, things began to shift. The gratitude they had once received slowly turned into an expectation. The sacrifices they had made, without a second thought, were no longer appreciated. Instead, they became part of the background noise of their family's routine. Thomas and Helen found themselves working harder and harder without any acknowledgement of their efforts. Every day, they woke up and gave their all, often feeling the weight of it in their bones. Yet all they received in return was silence, as if their dedication was just part of the deal. Then, the final blow came when Michael asked them for yet another favor. This time, it was for money. He and Sarah needed help buying a new car. Thomas and Helen, already stretched thin, didn't hesitate. They withdrew $10,000 from their hard-earned pension to help their son. But when Michael and Sarah saw the amount, their gratitude quickly turned into frustration. They scoffed at the contribution, claiming it wasn't enough. They demanded more, insisting that they needed a more expensive car, one beyond what Thomas and Helen could afford to give. It was at that moment, after everything they had done, that Thomas reached his breaking point. His voice was firm, laced with the frustration and disappointment he had been bottling up for far too long. "This is the money we've saved for our future," he said, his heart heavy. "If it's not enough, then you'll have to figure it out on your own. We can't give any more." Those words were a turning point. Michael and Sarah, now forced to confront their financial limitations, had no choice but to figure out the rest on their own. But for Thomas and Helen, that moment was a painful realization. Their unrelenting love and sacrifice had been taken for granted. The emotional toll of giving so much, only to feel rejected and undervalued, was far heavier than any amount of money could make up for. It was a wake-up call, a brutal reminder that, no matter how much you give, sometimes it's not enough, and you may still find yourself feeling invisible, unappreciated, and, ultimately, forgotten. As the years slowly passed, Thomas and Helen began to feel an unbearable weight of frustration and disillusionment settling in. The love, effort, and sacrifices they had poured into their family, particularly for their grandchild, seemed to be met with nothing more than indifference. Their grandchild, who they had cared for and supported in every possible way, was now old enough to start kindergarten, and with that milestone, Thomas suggested that they return to their beloved hometown in the Midwest, as they had originally planned long ago. It had been a dream of theirs for years, a chance to reconnect with the simpler, quieter life they had once known. Yet, even this innocent desire was met with resistance. Michael, their son, immediately began making excuses. He claimed that he couldn't manage the responsibility of caring for the child on his own, as if the years of support they had given him and his wife hadn't been enough to warrant even a moment of their peace. And so, Thomas and Helen, in their loyalty and love, stayed on in Chicago for a few more years, resigned to the fact that they would continue to put their dreams on hold. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But that fateful day, when Helen had fallen while rushing to pick up their grandchild, would be the catalyst for a shift in their hearts. As she lay in the hospital, bruised and broken, Thomas's world shattered. When Michael received the news, his response was not one of concern or love but of cold detachment. He told his parents that he simply couldn't spare the time to visit his mother because of the overtime at work. The same son they had given their everything to, the son they had sacrificed so much for, could not even find the time to show up for his mother. Thomas, devastated and heartbroken, found himself sitting by Helen's side in that sterile hospital room, tending to her needs while also managing the responsibilities they had once shared. It was a lonely and painful place to be, yet, in that silence, a profound realization began to take root in Thomas's mind. Sitting by his wife's bedside, he couldn't help but reflect on the years that had led them to this moment. The 15 years they had spent sacrificing their well-being for their grandchild's tuition, extracurricular activities, and the never-ending list of expenses. They had stretched their savings thin, giving without ever asking for anything in return. It wasn't the money they missed, it was the emotional connection, the sense of being seen and appreciated. But instead of gratitude, they were met with a heart-wrenching sting of indifference. Their son and daughter-in-law had come to view them as mere providers, their efforts taken for granted. The emotional toll of these years weighed heavily on Thomas's heart as he began to realize just how much they had allowed themselves to be used without question. And at this moment, when Helen's recovery was uncertain, Thomas felt every ounce of exhaustion, every drop of love unreturned, and every wound of unappreciation. When Helen was finally discharged from the hospital, her body frail but her spirit as strong as ever, Thomas knew it was time to make a change. Looking into his wife's eyes, filled with both sorrow and strength, he made a vow, one that came from the deepest parts of his soul. With a quiet yet unwavering voice, he told her, "It's time for us to go back home. It's time to start living our lives again." No longer would they be slaves to the emotional blackmail of their adult children. Despite the objections of Michael and his wife, despite the guilt that threatened to creep in, Thomas and Helen packed their things and returned to the small town in the Midwest where they had once felt truly alive. It was a bold and painful decision, but one that would lead them to the peace and fulfillment they had long since lost. Back in their hometown, surrounded by the peaceful countryside and the simplicity they had craved for so long, they finally began to feel the weight of their lives lift off their shoulders. The relentless stress of city life, the never-ending cycle of responsibilities, and the years of selflessness began to fade into the background. For the first time in ages, Thomas and Helen could breathe again. They could tend to their garden, savor the quiet moments together, and rediscover the joys of a life lived for themselves. It was a rebirth of sorts and a testament to the power of reclaiming one's happiness. Looking back, Thomas saw the years of sacrifice in a new light. Years that had been both full of love and completely draining. Their son, Michael, and his wife, Sarah, had become increasingly dependent on them, never once acknowledging the toll their constant requests were taking. Every plea for help, whether big or small, came with a sense of entitlement that left Thomas and Helen feeling invisible, used, and emotionally drained. They had given everything for their family, but in the end, they were left with nothing but the bitter taste of unappreciation. As he sat in the quiet of his new life, Thomas had an epiphany that would forever change the way he viewed his role as a parent. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give our children is the space to stand on their own 2 feet. The time had come for him and Helen to stop enabling their adult children's reliance on them, to stop sacrificing their peace for the sake of others. It was their turn now, and for the first time in years, they were ready to live for themselves. Let me take a moment to share the deeply moving story of Margaret Williams, a 70-year-old woman who found herself caught in the whirlwind of caregiving and city life. Margaret had spent the last year in the fast-paced suburbs of Chicago, living with her son Jeff and his wife Linda, helping to care for their 2 young grandchildren. It wasn't just the bustling city that drained her, it was the overwhelming weight of responsibility she placed on herself. Jeff and Linda, both working demanding sales jobs, were rarely at home, leaving Margaret to carry the entire burden of the household. Every day, from the moment the sun rose, Margaret was up at 5 a.m., preparing breakfast for the entire family. She would lovingly feed her grandchildren, wash the dishes, do the laundry, and get lunch ready, all before the clock even hit noon. And yet, her work was far from over. In the afternoons, she would pick up the older grandchildren from school, only to return home and immediately begin preparing dinner. By the time she'd finished cleaning up after the evening meal, the clock would be edging toward 9 p.m., and Margaret would feel utterly depleted. There were no breaks, no moments of respite, just a relentless, grueling cycle of tasks, all of which left her with little to no time to care for herself. Despite the toll this lifestyle was taking on her body, Margaret refused to stop. She felt bound by a deep sense of duty to her family, unable to say no to anyone. Even when her health began to decline, fainting twice due to exhaustion and suffering from dangerously low blood pressure, Margaret kept pushing herself forward. The idea of taking time for herself seemed foreign. Friends from her hometown reached out, inviting her to visit to reconnect, but she declined every invitation. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving her family behind, especially since she believed hiring someone to help would just be too expensive and too unreliable. Her husband Jack, who lived in their small hometown, urged Margaret to return and take a well-deserved break. But Margaret's sense of obligation kept her tethered to the chaos of Chicago. She couldn't reconcile the idea of stepping away from her family, not when they seemed so dependent on her. Yet, deep inside, Margaret began to feel a gnawing anxiety. She was growing older, her body was no longer able to keep up, and her dream of enjoying a peaceful, fulfilling retirement felt increasingly out of reach. With every passing day, the emotional and physical exhaustion mounted, and Margaret couldn't help but wonder whether she had made the right choices. Was this what the last years of her life were supposed to look like? And then there's the story of 67-year-old Helen Carter, a woman whose heart, much like Margaret's, was filled with love for her family but also with the burden of years of sacrifice. 3 years ago, Helen decided to leave her own life behind and move to San Francisco to help her son Jason and his family. Before this, Helen had faced countless tensions with her daughter-in-law, Linda. She had always adhered to a more traditional approach to parenting, but Linda, with her independent and modern views, had made it difficult for Helen to feel fully appreciated. The clashes between them had left Helen feeling unrecognized and exhausted. When Jason called once again, with his voice trembling with urgency, asking for her help, Helen's heart was torn. She had already given so much of herself. She was tired, physically, mentally, emotionally, but her son's words weighed heavily on her. "Mom," Jason said, his voice thick with stress, "the cost of living here is just too high, and there's no one else we can rely on. We need you." Helen, despite all the emotional scars from past struggles, couldn't say no. The love for her son outweighed the pain of the past. But in the depths of her heart, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. It was a call to duty but also a call to sacrifice. And once again, Helen found herself giving everything: her time, her energy, and perhaps most importantly, the little bit of joy she had left in her own life. She wondered, just like Margaret, if there would ever come a day when she could sit back and enjoy the peace she so richly deserved. In both Margaret's and Helen's stories, we see the heartache of selfless love, the emotional turmoil of responsibility, and the internal struggle to find balance. These women, in their deep commitment to their families, have lost sight of their well-being, and the result is a growing sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. It's so easy for us to lose ourselves in the roles we play for others, to give and give until there's nothing left to give. But at what cost? Margaret and Helen are just two examples of a much larger story, one that speaks to the deep, universal truth. We cannot pour from an empty cup. In the end, we must remember that taking care of ourselves is not selfish, it's necessary. Only then can we truly be there for those we love. Reluctantly, Helen found herself agreeing to help her daughter, Linda, despite her deep fears about what stepping back into the role of caregiver would do to their already strained relationship. She had hoped that her decision would somehow ease the tension, but instead, it only intensified it. One evening, as she tried to keep the children entertained during dinner, she thought back to the cartoons she had loved as a child and decided to show them something she thought would bring joy. But before she could even get comfortable, Linda interrupted, complaining that the show wasn't appropriate for the kids. The words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. Her frustration boiled over, and she shot back, "You've never spent a full day with them, so you don't understand how wild they can get. Sometimes, I need a way to calm them down." Helen's voice wavered with emotion, but the hurt she felt was undeniable. It was as if Linda couldn't see how difficult it was to juggle everything, how exhausting it could be to try and entertain children who never seemed to settle down. And yet, Linda's judgment only made her feel smaller and more invisible. In the days that followed, these kinds of disagreements became a regular occurrence. Linda, who had different values and ideas about parenting, would frequently criticize Helen's more traditional approach. She would scoff at Helen's attempts to discipline the children, and with every word, Helen's heart grew heavier. The constant undermining of her choices left her feeling disrespected, unappreciated, and, quite frankly, invisible in her own family. It was as if all the love, care, and wisdom she had poured into raising her children had somehow become irrelevant. The thought that she might no longer be seen as an authority, a guide, or even a support system in her own home was a painful realization that tore at her. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Helen began to feel the aching sting of isolation. It was as though, despite her sacrifices, she had been pushed to the periphery of her family's life, her opinions dismissed as outdated or insignificant. The woman who had once been the rock, the constant, now felt like a stranger in a space that should have been filled with comfort and love. It was heartbreaking. It made her question whether all the years of care and effort had been worth it if they were now being overlooked so easily. It was a devastating feeling of being taken for granted. On the other hand, we have Diane Miller, a 60-year-old woman who has found herself in a different place emotionally and mentally. Living in Portland, Oregon, Diane's perspective on helping with child-rearing was starkly different from Helen's. "I've worked hard all my life," Diane would say, her voice firm and resolute. "Now, I just want to enjoy my retirement with my husband. I've earned it." And as much as she loved her family, Diane firmly believed that over-involvement in child-rearing could do more harm than good. Diane understood that sometimes stepping in to help with grandchildren, while it came from a place of love, could create a sense of dependency, not just in the children but in her adult children as well. She had learned the hard way that constantly giving of herself without considering her own needs would only lead to resentment and exhaustion. When her son and his wife, Amber, began discussing the possibility of having a second child, Diane didn't hesitate to voice her concerns. She sat down with them and, in a calm yet passionate tone, said, "Having more children can be a lot of fun, but it doubles the burden. Before you make any decisions, think carefully about whether you're both ready to handle it." Diane's words were grounded in wisdom and experience, but despite her reservations, her son and Amber went ahead with the decision. Yet, Diane was unwavering when it came to setting her boundaries. She refused to throw herself into the role of full-time caregiver. Instead, Diane chose to make her contribution in a way that allowed her to maintain her sense of self. Each month, she sent $500 from her pension to cover the cost of a professional babysitter, understanding that this arrangement would give her son and his wife the support they needed without sacrificing her happiness or well-being. She loved her grandchildren dearly, but she wasn't going to let them take away the peace and joy she had worked so hard to achieve in her later years. The lesson we can learn from these 2 different perspectives is incredibly powerful and important. When elderly parents step in to help their children without setting clear, firm boundaries, it can quickly lead to burnout, emotionally, mentally, and physically. Helen's story demonstrates how, in some cases, this kind of self-sacrifice doesn't always lead to the warm, loving family environment one might expect. Instead, it can breed frustration, resentment, and a sense of being undervalued. A parent's unconditional love and sacrifice are undoubtedly admirable, but they do not come without consequences. When parents pour everything into their children, they risk creating an environment where the adult children feel entitled to that support without learning to take responsibility for themselves. At the same time, Diane's story shows us that it's possible to love and support your children without losing yourself in the process. Setting boundaries is not a sign of weakness or indifference. It's a sign of strength, wisdom, and self-care. As parents age, they must prioritize their health and happiness. The relentless pursuit of self-sacrifice can be emotionally draining and physically damaging, stripping away the joy they should be experiencing in their later years. By creating space for themselves and drawing clear lines around their involvement in family matters, elderly parents can foster healthier, more balanced relationships with their children and grandchildren. Ultimately, parents need to communicate openly, set firm boundaries, and encourage their children to take responsibility for their own lives. Supporting your children is important, yes, but it should never come at the cost of your well-being. Love, support, and independence can coexist harmoniously when each family member is given the space to thrive in their way. After all, The ultimate goal is not just to give endlessly, but to create relationships where respect, love, and personal happiness are valued above all. As we wrap up today's discussion, I hope these stories have given you some valuable insights into the delicate balance of love, support, and setting boundaries in family relationships, especially as we get older. So, what have you learned so far? Think about how you can apply these lessons in your own life. I'd love to hear from you. What's one thing you've learned today that you plan to bring into practice? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave your comments, like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful content. Your support helps us bring more helpful videos to those who need them. Thank you for being a part of our community, and I'll see you in the next video.